We are studying together the halachot of Gevinat, of cheese. And if you may have looked at my other source sheets, you've been with us for the last 7 weeks, you'll have noticed that the source sheets are about 17 pages, 20 pages, 22 pages. Today's source sheet is 34 pages long. And so I want to echo what Ohad said just a minute ago, and that is, I understand that we have questions. I will answer questions. So if there's a question that it's getting in the way, you can't understand what's happening next, please feel free to ask it. But questions that intend to repeat a point or clarify a point or ask me something that's a tangent, I will stay here for as long as you need after the shiur. For me, it's the middle of the day, and so I will, as I always do, stay here even for half an hour after the shiur, and I'm happy to answer all of those questions then. B'ezrat Hashem Yitbarach. I rarely choose to jump into the lion's den. Sometimes I do. Like, there are certain things that I've chosen. That's my crusade. That's the altar that I wish to die on. The cheese thing in Judaism is not my altar, so that's not where I choose to die. I know that for many people, this is not just a topic of much importance, but it's a topic of much passion, and they're very set in how they understand these halachot, and that's wonderful. And Baruch Hashem, that's why the Habura offers a selection of teachers to choose from. Like when you're on an airline, we know you have many options when flying. Thank you for choosing Delta Airlines. So many options when learning the Untitled Kashrut. I thank you for flying with me. And while you're flying with me, I hope to share with you my perspective on these halachot as I see them. My Rabbi, Harav Peretz, when he was a young man, went to go take his semicha exams, then from the Ashkenazi chief rabbi of Yerushalayim. Rabbi Zolti was his name. Alav Shalom. And the Rabbi Peretz studied very well the laws of basar b'chalav, meat and milk, and the laws of ta'aruvot, all the forbidden food combinations. And let's just say that in the laws of melicha, salting meat, that wasn't his most proficient area. And so when he came to Rabbi Zolti, he would ask him a question about basar b'chalav, he would answer him, and ta'aruvot, he would answer him. And when it came time to ask questions on melicha, every single question Rav Zolti asked him on melicha, he said, that reminds me of a shach in basar b'chalav. That reminds me of a taz in ta'aruvot. That reminds me of something in Hilchot Shabbat. It would drag him somewhere where he was more comfortable answering those questions, and that was his tactic for getting through a semicha exam. Of course, he told us that in preparation for our semicha exams, and I am telling this to you in preparation for the Mishnah that you and I are about to study. Rarely do we find the Mishnah with this type of personality, if I could call it that. And I want to focus your attention on page 1. Page 1, source 1, Amar Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda said, Sha'al Rabbi Yishmael et Rabbi Yehoshua k'shayum halchin baderech. Rabbi Yishmael asked Rabbi Yehoshua all kinds of questions while they were walking along the road. That's the fulfillment of what the Torah says, that you must study Torah sitting in your home, when you walk on the road, when you lay down, when you wake up. So studying Torah is a constant effort. We don't just sit down 1 hour a day, study Torah. Our whole life is the study of Torah. Maybe if I could share with you some milta de agadata, some words that don't belong in the shiur. There's a famous Mishnah. And the Mishnah says that someone who's walking along the road and studying Torah while they're walking along the road, and they stop and they see a tree, and they see, wow, how beautiful is that tree? The Mishnah says, Harei ze mitchayev benafsho. This person is, I don't know if the exact translation is liable for the death penalty, but they're causing immense damage to their soul. Let's translate it that way. And it's a little bewildering. What's the big deal? You're walking down the street. You notice a beautiful creation of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So you pause from learning Torah, and you say, how wonderful is that tree? I heard from some that suggest the proper reading of this Mishnah is, and I'm not telling you this is Peshat, that when you walk along the road and you're studying Torah, and then you see a beautiful tree, and you think that for one moment, the appreciation of nature, of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, is somehow divorced from your study of Torah. So much so that you must stop studying Torah in order to appreciate the beauty of the tree. Then you've totally missed the point of what the Torah is trying to do for you. The whole world is a wholesome limud Torah. And so when you find two chachamim that are traveling together, it shouldn't surprise you that they're also studying Torah. Amar lo, Rabbi Yishmael asked Rabbi Yehuda, Mipnei ma asru gevinot hagoyim. What is the reason that they prohibited the cheese of non-Jews? Amar lo, mipnei shema'amidin ota bekevash nevela. Because they ma'amidim, they curdle the cheese. How do you take this? You take cheese, the way you make cheese, you take dairy, milk, and you pour inside of it a curdling agent. Most of the time, in the times of the Talmud especially, they were using the lining of the cow's stomach. It has an enzyme inside of it, we call it rennet today, and that is what curdles the cheese. I'm not an expert in cheese making, so if you're a little more proficient in how to make cheese, and my layman explanation of cheese making is not sufficient, then you're welcome to look in encyclopedia afterwards. It's because they use the keva, the stomach of a nevela, of an animal that was not slaughtered, meaning it died. And then he tells them, "Va'alo kevat olah chamura mekevat nevela." He said, but there's other kevot that are worse than that of a nevela. Why not that? Chazal. So he changed his mind. Amar lo, no, that's not the reason. Mipnei shema'amidin oto bekevat egle avodah zara. The reason is because they use the stomach lining of the calves that were used for idol worship. Amar lo. Rabbi Yishmael tells him, Rabbi, if that's the case, if that's the reason, we can't eat cheese from goyim because they use the stomach lining of cows that were used in the worship of idols. Lama lo asaruha v'hana'ah. Why did the Chachamim not tell us that it's forbidden to receive any benefit from the cheese of non-Jews? If you're dealing with something that has a connection to idol worship, then it's not just eating it that you can't do, you can't even sell it, you can't be involved in it. What does Rabbi Yehuda do? He si'ola davar acher. He dragged the conversation to somewhere else. He didn't want to answer his question. Amar lo, he says, Yishmael achi, Yishmael my brother. He'ach ata koreh, how do you read the verse in Shir HaShirim? Ki tovim dodecha miyayin. Because, they translate here in English? Because your dodecha, your love is better than wine. Let's pretend that's what we're reading here, okay? O ki tovim dodaich, or because, in feminine, dodaich. אמר לו כי טובים דודייך, אמר לו אין הדבר כן, שהרי חברו מלמד עליו לריח שמניך טובים. The next verse is written in the masculine, and therefore you must read the end of the verse is in masculine, the beginning of the verse must be masculine also. I'm sure if you study this Mishnah on an Agadic level, there's a reason why this random Midrash and Shir HaShirim appears here. We're not here to study Agadah today. What I can tell you is that Rabbi Yishmael asked a good question, and Rabbi Yehuda didn't have a good answer. And what did he do? He decided to drag him somewhere else so he would stop this line of questioning and end up somewhere else. You know, in my Kehillat, every Shabbat afternoon, we have a shiur, a Q&A session. And over there, the rule is there's no cameras. Finally, there's no YouTube, there's no podcast, nothing comes out of it. We don't record on Shabbat. And so because of that, we're able to talk about all kinds of things that we want to talk about if they were for public consumption. And I always tell them, listen, I know the questions are good. I hope that my answers are as good as the questions. Unfortunately, in this department, Rabbi Yehuda clearly either didn't want to answer him, didn't answer him for whatever reason, and distracts him to a different conversation. Before we understand exactly what happened in this Mishnah, let's really ask the question, why are cheeses of goyim prohibited? What is it from the non-Jewish cheese that makes that cheese prohibited to us? Number 2, source 2, Talmud Bavli. The Gemara says, let's look on page 2. On the bottom right column. The reason why he didn't want to answer his question is because it was a new decree. And being that there was a new decree, we don't scrutinize it or its origins. When the rabbis make a decree, we accept the decree. We don't dig into that decree too much. We don't publicize the reasoning behind the decree. Lest someone come and maybe say, oh, it doesn't make any sense, I don't want to follow it. We don't give room to questioning a new gezerah of our rabbis. My gezerta, so our rabbis trying to say, what exactly is the gezerah? So Rabbi Shimon ben Pazi says in the name of Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi, Mishum nikur. The reason why we're not allowed to have cheese from non-Jews is because of nikur. Now we call nikur in Sephardic tradition when we puncture the animal and we rid it of the gid hanasheh, the sciatica nerve. But here in nikur in the Gemara, when we see nikur, puncture means by a snake. There's a prohibition of drinking certain beverages, for example water, left out overnight, for the reason that maybe a snake will come and put its venom inside of the water. Now, Maran Shulchan Aruch already says that today we don't live with snakes. I mean, the only time you might have a pet snake in your house is if you have one that's a pet. But for the most part, those of us intentionally have homes that are proofed in such a way that we don't have snakes and scorpions running around our home, and therefore there's no reason to prohibit water that was left out overnight, but he's because of nikul. Maybe a snake will come and inject his venom. I mean, they're not careful about covering their milk or their cheese, and we will then be in a danger of sakana because of the snake venom. When they make a decree in the west, so he explains that until 12 months have passed from when the rabbis make a decree, we don't give the reason for the decree so that someone won't hear it and then make a commotion about it and get rid of that decree. Megadef bar Rabbi Yirmiyah. Rabbi Yirmiyah says, I think that this idea of Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi is ludicrous. Because of snakes, that's the reason why we can't eat the cheese. There's all kinds of other things then that we should prohibit because of snakes. So let's skip down to the bottom. Rabbi Chanina says, the reason we can't is because we know that the milk, maybe the milk is not kasher. But what happens, we said last week already, that if you curdle milk and it turns into cheese, then you already know that that milk is kasher. Now what would happen if there's a combination of milk, or maybe there's not kasher, whatever it would be? So he's saying we're worried about, there are other ways to interpret this Gemara, I'm just reading it simply. There's the residue of the leftover milk that is on the surface of the cheese. So the cheese itself is kasher because we know it's now we can verify that it's kasher cheese. But the liquids that are on the surface of the cheese, they are not kasher, and because of that we can't eat the cheese. Ushmuel Amar, and Shemuel says, Mipnei shema'amidin ota be'or kevat nevena. The reason is because they curdle the cheese in the stomach lining of an unslaughtered animal. So that is a nevela. So far, we have a number of reasons, either because of snakes, scorpions, or because of the problem of the residue of non-kasher milk, now because of the stomach lining of the animal. I'm going to skip a few more paragraphs. Let's look on page 3 in the left-hand column. Rav Malkiah Mishmed Rav Ada bar Ahava Amar Mipnei shemachlikin paneha b'shuman chazir. He has a unique suggestion. Then he says it's because they coat the cheese with the fat of pigs. Right? Well, that's what he said. Rav Chizda says, Mipnei shema'amidin ota b'chometz. Because they use vinegar. What's the problem with vinegar? It comes from wine. Wine could be a real problem. So because they use vinegar to curdle the cheese, we're afraid of the non-kasher vinegar inside of the milk. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak Amar, Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak says, Mipnei shema'amidin oto b'saraf ha'olam. Because they use the sap that's from an orla tree, which is prohibited to us, and because of that, we're not allowed to have this cheese. The Gemara continues in a number of different places, and ultimately, you look at this Gemara and you say, the Chachamim made a gezerah. But the reason for the gezerah initially wasn't given, because we don't give reasons for the gezerot when it's too fresh of a gezerah. But then when they start giving us reasons of the gezerah, we see all kinds of things that are, they clearly are, it seems almost like we threw the arrow, and now we're trying to come up with the target around it. Like, why did we throw this arrow? What's the reason for this? What's the prohibition here? That's why I believe that it's important to look at the Rambam's understanding of the Mishnah. And the Rambam, as he always does for us, clarifies things so clearly. The Rambam, and this time I was using the regular Sefaria edition of the Rambam's Perush Mishnayot, and the Hebrew is so poor, Kehillat, for the translator, that you simply don't understand what the Rambam wants from you. And so I sat there and I scanned that I typed up this Rav Kapach Rambam for you, just so you could see the way Rav Kapach, he understands the Arabic and translates it into beautiful Hebrew for us. Look at source 3, which is on the bottom of page 4, but really it starts on the top of page 4 on the left. Hatam shelo hodiu sibat yisuram. The reason why our rabbis did not tell us the reason for the prohibition, because we were afraid it was too close to the time of the initial ruling, and people would come to mock that ruling. So we know this. And therefore, was the practice when the rabbis would prohibit something by method of gizera, they would wait for the gizera a year to pass. Why a year? By then, everybody was doing it. He mentions here the woman, the nation, everybody, even the people not in the Beit HaMidrash, they already caught on. It became the new fad. Think about the kashrut world that you know of. Somebody comes up with a chumrah last week. Tomorrow, not everyone's going to be doing that chumrah, but give it a year, and every rabbi in the world is going to tell you have to do whatever they decided last year. Similar idea here, lahavdil, by these gezerot. It takes time to catch on. Once it catches on, and then afterwards, they tell everybody that was the decree, now is the reason. So that's the reason why he didn't answer him. But what's the reason for why we can't eat cheese of goyim? Says the Rambam, v'sibat isur Gevinat shem goyim. And the reason why the cheese is prohibited to us, shema ya'amidena be'or kevat nivela, because maybe they will come to make our cheese with non-kasher animal rennet, meaning from the unslaughtered animal. Shagam hu ma'amid. V'yadua keshechitat hanochri nivela. And we know that the slaughter of a non-Jew is halachically considered to us a nivela. And you might think, hey, I can't put rennet from an animal inside of the milk to make cheese because of a prohibited mixture of meat and milk. No? And let me remind you of halakha here. The prohibition of eating meat and milk together only applies to meat that was cooked with milk. The meat has to be kasher, the milk has to be kasher, and both of them have to be cooked together. You are forbidden from eating that meat and milk that was cooked together. You're forbidden from getting benefit from it. And you are forbidden from actually cooking it. But cold meat and milk that were mixed together, the prohibition there is only a rabbinic prohibition. So the difference between a grilled cheeseburger with the cheese grilled on top of the burger and a salami sandwich, and please nobody walk out of the shiur saying, oh, it's Rabbi Halevy's class. He said you can have salami sandwich with cheese. I didn't tell you that. I'm just telling you that prohibition is a rabbinic prohibition. לפי שאין בשר בחלב אוסר, אלא בנותן טעם, כמו שווה בחולין. Says the Rambam, the prohibition of meat and milk mixing together is only prohibited when you can taste the meat. אלא נאסרה מחמת שחיטת נוחי. And there's so little rennet here, you don't taste the animal inside of the cheese. But the prohibition is because of the non-Jewish slaughter. ואין אומרים בזה אחד משישים, and the reason why we cannot say that it's nullified 1 in 60. Really, it's not that much rennet that has to go when you see the cheese making process. These huge vats of cheese they pour rennet into. But there is certainly 60 times more milk than there is rennet. Mipnei shehu ma'amid. It's because it is a davar ha'ma'amid. Davar ha'ma'amid, and next week we're going to talk about gelatin and those things. Don't ask me kushiyot today about next week. A davar ha'ma'amid, something that is used to form the product, meaning it's not a nullified ingredient. The rennet is what makes the milk into cheese. You can't nullify something that is the primary ingredient of something. And you can sense that you can tell that this milk is now cheese because of the rennet. And now all of that milk is considered nivela. לפי שדבר האסור אם נתערב עם המותר והייתה פעולה אותו הדבר האסור ניכרת ונראית ולא איבד במיעוטו ולא נעלם, הרי זה אוסר את הכל. Like any other forbidden mixture, when the forbidden thing is not lost, and not only is it not lost, but it's there. Not only is it there, but it's the primary ingredient of this cheese, aside from milk. It's what makes this into cheese. Then it makes the whole cheese prohibited. And even if the prohibited thing was tiny, we don't do any of these 1/60th rules or 100th rules or anything else like he explains elsewhere. In the next paragraph, I broke up the Rambam into paragraphs. It's one paragraph. And the ma'amid, the curdling agent, the one that makes it into cheese, is more stringent than something that sours or seasons. Our rabbis told us, the status always goes after what made this into cheese. But the stomach lining of the cow itself, I mean the cow's stomach, cow stomach is actually permissible. Because cow stomach is not really part of a cow halachically. Our rabbis don't consider the stomach of a cow meat. It's considered something that came out of a cow, but it's not actually cow. Listen to what the Rambam tells you. We're not worried here about the kashrut of the cow stomach. You can go to the goyim and buy their cow stomachs, meaning shechitat nevela. It's not a real kasher. The cow is kasher, of course, but the slaughter was done improperly. You can buy those cow stomachs and use them in your home to make cheese. The prohibition is on them making the cheese with the cow stomach. Therefore, if we see the non-Jew, shehe'emid Gevinat bekeva atzma, we see him pour the milk into the cow stomach. That was the old way of making it. You would take the cow stomach, you pour milk, you tie it up, and it would turn into cheese inside of the cow stomach. But let's say you do it the other way. We see the non-Jew pour the rennet into the vat of milk. Mutar lanu lechol ota gevina. Says the Rambam, it's permissible for us to eat that cheese. Velo to'il hashemua b'zeh, velo hecha hadat el hariyah b'ayin. And no other method works. You can't assume, you can't hear, it's not like the other rules, like Chalav Yisrael or others. This has to do with a Jewish person seeing the process. That is what makes the cheese kasher. So everything you learned with me last week about Chalav Yisrael, you have to forget it for this gezerah here of Gevinat. Last week we already shown that Chalav Yisrael is not actually prohibition. It was something that our rabbis taught us in order to make sure that we consume kasher milk. Here, it has to do with kashrut, yes, but it's not a matter of kashrut. Even if you are certain that this cheese is kasher, you still can't eat it unless the Jewish person supervised the pouring of the rennet into the milk or the milk into the cow's stomach. Then if you want to ask me, says the Rambam, why is the cheese not prohibited? Because of the reason that it comes from milk that's not Chalav Yisrael. Because the reason for that prohibition was maybe they'll mix the not kosher milk with kosher milk and we're going to consume not kosher milk. The kalal hu etzlenu, and there's a rule in our hands, chalav behema temea eno omed, that the milk of a non-kosher animal does not curdle. And therefore the only prohibition that is left in terms of cheese is because they use a nevela, cow stomach, in order to make the cheese. And this is a rabbinic decree, not a matter of kashrut, of meat and milk. So get that out of your head. It's not a problem to mix the cow stomach with the milk. In America here, there was a certain company that put out these cauliflower pancakes. And in there it has cheese. It's kasher. It has kasher and everything from the whatever company. And in there it says, yeah, it can't be kosher. You have to recall this product. It says kosher animal enzymes in the cheese. What kind of crazy people put meat inside of milk? And the Jewish community over and over shows its burut, its ignorance of halakha, when it thinks that cheese traditionally is made with meat. That's how you make cheese. And it's allowed. Because according to halakha, that meat is not meat. And all the things that we were told otherwise, okay, stop listening to people and start reading more of the Rambam's Pirush on the Mishnah. That's all I can tell you. I don't know what to tell you that. Now, Tosafot pops in here in source 4. He has a slightly nuanced understanding of this basar b'chalav issue. I don't want to get into it right now. Let's look at the more exciting Tosafot in source 5. Why is this Tosafot exciting? For those of you who are familiar with the methodology of Tosafot, you sometimes realize that they are, some would call creative when it comes to Talmudic rulings. I don't like the word creative. Sometimes it's almost disregarding entirely of. But they're creative in their disregarding of Talmudic rules. And as such, you're going to read a creative Tosafot here that the Sephardic Chachamim emphatically reject, but Tosafot says anyways. Let's go on. Vomer Rabbeinu Tam, in the bold part. Rabbeinu Tam says in page 5, source 5. Ki achshav, that now, lo matzinu tam pashut lisur b'gvinat hagoyim. There is no clear reason to prohibit non-Jewish cheese. Because the real reason why we're not allowed to eat cheese from goyim is because of the reason of Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi, who said it's because of the snakes. Because in the rules of deciding which Chachamim we follow and which we don't, Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi trumps Rabbi Yochanan, and certainly he trumps Shemuel. And he tells us, and it's not just his opinion, that in many places we find that Chachamei Ashkenaz rule like Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi over the others, and therefore Rabbeinu Tam says the real reason for why we're not allowed to have cheese from goyim is because of the snake venom. And therefore, Therefore, if we live in a place like today where we're not worried about snake venom, then all the cheese of the goyim, there's no real clear reason to prohibit. Notice that he doesn't say it's permissible. We're going to pick on that later. But he says there's no clear reason to prohibit it anymore. Now the next paragraph, and I made Tosafot into paragraphs just so we could have some clarity of thought. You don't have to worry about mixing in non-kasher milk there. Because the goyim are not stupid. They wouldn't put milk that doesn't curdle together with milk that curdles. I mean, they might cheat you by milk, but not by cheese. The only reason why it's prohibited is because of the snakes, and where we live there are no problems of snakes putting their venom into the milk, and therefore the cheese of goyim is permissible. And you cannot say that this is a prohibition of minyan, meaning the rabbis of the Sanhedrin, the final Bedin Hagadol in Israel, they prohibited cheese and we're not allowed to get rid of it. We need another Sanhedrin to uproot this ruling. Because it is certain to me, says Rabbi Yonatan, that the Chachamim who made this decree made it because of the snakes, and they intended that when there would be no snakes, the cheese of the goyim would be permitted. And there are many places, they eat the cheese of goyim because they don't use rennet to make the cheese into cheese, but they use flowers. Meaning, they found another plant that is able to curdle milk, and therefore there's not a problem of kashrut at all. This is what's called vegetable rennet. This is the original vegetarian rennet that is put into cheese that many of you have asked me over the years. And therefore, says Tosafot, that in many places, forget the snakes. Even in the matters of kashrut, we're not even worried about the animal lining of the stomach. V'gam gonei narbon. Narbona, I think they say narbon in English. And also those chachamim in France, they permitted it because of the fact that the goyim don't use animal rennet anymore, but they use vegetarian rennet. Then he adds one last point. Mihu, nonetheless, bimkomenu, in our place, shema'amidin bekeva, that they use the stomach lining. Omer harav ri ben Rabbi Chaim sheyesh ta'am k'tzat ne'asor. There's some reason to prohibit. מפני שמולכין הקיבה בהוראה ואיכא איסור דבשר בחלב דמניח היו כרותח ואני ראיתי מקומות שאין מעמידין בנבלת דבר אחר מניח. He says there's a problem specific to his locale where they would salt this cow lining. He was worried about a mixture of basar b'chalav, and so he throws that in, that in a place like where I live there may be a problem. But again, the summary of Rabbi Yonatan, the only reason why the cheese is prohibited, nothing to do with kivat nevela. So he disagrees with the Rambam. The ruling is not Shemuel. We don't care about what Shemuel said in the Gemara. We care about what Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi said. Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi said snakes, that's the only problem. And you'll tell me, but it was instituted by Sanhedrin. So if the reason disappears, you can't just get rid of a rule that a Sanhedrin made. We know that rule. Says Rabbi Yonatan, that doesn't matter. What do you mean it doesn't matter? It doesn't matter because our Chachamim, when they made this decree, only instituted it in places where there were problems of snakes. And when there's no problem of a snake, our rabbis would agree that there is no gezerah in that place. So to summarize here, there's a tremendous difference between the way Rambam sees this Gemara and the way Rabbi Yonatan sees this Gemara. Now that shouldn't surprise you. But this is an unsettled debate. And it's going to be unsettled because you're going to find echoes of this later on in Jewish history. But before I get there, let me show you what the other Chachamim in the neighborhood were saying about this prohibition. Let's look at the Rashba. The Rashba writes, Gevinat shel kutim, censored. Gevinat shel goyim, the cheese of non-Jews. Lo yadati tam hamatirim lachem. The Rashba is writing a letter to a certain community. He says, I don't know who permitted you to eat the cheese of non-Jews. Bilti mit'u b'tam shne'emar aleh b'Gemara. Unless the rabbis who told you it's okay, they incorrectly understood the Gemara, meaning they're mistaken. The reason we don't eat cheese of goyim like the Rambam is because of the stomach of the non-kasher, of the non-slaughtered animal, the nevela. And these mistaken people will tell you that now that we are experts, we know that in our places they only use vegetables, meaning a vegetarian source, as a curdling agent. That the reason for the prohibition has disappeared, and therefore the decree of our rabbis has disappeared with it. And this is the mistake in their hands, says the Rashba. מפני שאיסור גבינה של גויים נעשה במניין החכמים אור עולם רבותינו הקדושים. The prohibition of cheese was not made by your local rabbi in the neighborhood. The prohibition of cheese was made by the Chachmei Talmud. This is a Sanhedrin, it's a Bedin HaGadol. They made a prohibition for us. He calls them Or Olam Rabotenu, because the light of the world, our holy rabbis. They prohibited something. It's a davar hanesar b'minyan. V'chol davar shenesar b'minyan. And everything that was prohibited in that fashion, af al pi shebatel ta'am ha'isur, even though the reason is no longer relevant, en adam reshai levatelo, no person has permission to get rid of a rabbinic decree. V'afilu im nimnu alav bedin acharehem. And even if another bedin comes along and says, we're going to repeal an earlier Talmudic law, en bedin reshai levatelo, אלא אם כן הבדין האחרון גדול מן הראשון בחוכמה ובמניין. The only time they can is if the second bedin is greater in number and in quality than the previous bedin, which is obviously not the case. It's amazing to me, by the way, because we're coming up to Pesach, and I hear so many people telling me that the reason they cannot eat kitniot on Pesach is because it's a decree that you're not allowed to uproot. And this decree that has been decreed by nobody, we don't know who decreed that decree. We don't know of a name of a bedin or a Sanhedrin that actually formally prohibited kitniot. We know many communities that didn't eat kitniot, but no Gezeran, a bedin hagadol of anywhere, let alone in Yerushalayim. But we can't because we don't have a bedin that is greater than that one. It's a faulty argument. But here, by cheese, they don't seem to mind so much. But this one is really from the Talmud. ועוד, and furthermore, כי באיסור גבינה, כבר נאמר טעם אחר מפני תערובת חלב תמש, נשארו בין נקבי הגבינה בתוכה. Says the Rashba, there's also the second reason, that maybe there is non-kasher milk that is still left as residue on top of the cheese. And even if you were to tell me that there's no problem of the gizera, there's still a problem of kashrut in that type of situation. So you see from the Rashba that this is the davar hanesar b'minyan. It doesn't matter if the reason doesn't apply. You can tell me we have vegetable rennet, microbial rennet. That doesn't make a difference, says the Rashba. The Chachamim prohibited cheese of goyim. They prohibited cheese of goyim. Period. End of story. Let's look at the next source. The Or Zarua writes that in Eretz Canaan, everybody treats the cheese of the goyim in a prohibited fashion. V'chalila l'shum yirei shamayim lehatir davar kazeh. And how dare a God-fearing person say that cheese of goyim is permissible? Source 8, the Magid Mishneh, is a fascinating spin. I'm not bringing this to halakha, but as I was looking yesterday, he mentions that the reason why, he says there are all kinds of reasons why the Chachamim gave, which we read, why cheese is prohibited. But on the top of page 6, he says that there are Chachamim who say that the reason why cheese is prohibited is because our rabbis wanted to distance us from the non-Jews and their foods. Very similar to the bread of goyim and the food, the cooked foods of goyim. But this is really not an opinion that we use in halakha. I just wanted to bring it to you for the sake of completion. In general, in the source sheets that I bring before you, I don't go through all the sources, and I don't have time to go through all the sources. But I bring you these sources, and I bring them in full. Like you'll see some teshuvot, they're 4 pages long. Why did I bother you printing 4 pages? I know that you might not have those books at home, and I want to make sure that later, when you have a chance to review this material on Shabbat, or in a few years from now, wherever else it will be, that you'll be able to look back and find what you were looking for, and have it in full, and not just random selections or quotes from different places. Now let's come to the tool. The tool, I think, is one of the most misunderstood chachamim in the world. The tool is an Ashkenazi chacham born in a Sephardic country, trying to be an Ashkenazi rabbi in a Sephardic community that follows quasi-Ashkenazi customs and Sephardic customs in a very confused way. For the Sephardim, he's too Ashkenazi to follow. For the Ashkenazim, he's too Sephardic to follow. In any which way, the tool mentions the same thing. In source 8 on page 6, Gevinat hagoyim asurot. The cheese of the goyim are prohibited, and there's kama ta'amim. The rabbis gave a few reasons for this. But then he quotes again, Katav HaRambam, the Rambam writes, Afilu im en lachush le'elu. Even if you're not worried about that, Kegon sheyadua she'mida ba'asavim ve'en b'chalav tameh, that even if the cheese of the goyim was made with herbs, meaning asavim, vegetable sources, it's still a problem. Why? Let's look at the Rambam inside. Let's skip a second. Come with me to page 8. Let's look at page 8 for a moment. We'll read the Rambam and you'll get as much clarity. In the bold, on page 8 in source Yud, Ugvinat hagoyim muteret. Says the Rambam in the Laws of Forbidden Foods, chapter 3, the cheese of goyim is forbidden, permissible. She'en chalab behema tema mitgaben. Because the milk of goyim, if it's not kasher, it won't curdle. If it curdles, it tells you the cheese is kasher. But in the days of the rabbis of the Mishnah, gazru al Gevinat hagoyim. They made a decree, a gezerah, against the cheese of goyim. V'asaruha mipnei shema'amidin ota be'or hakeva shenishchitatan shein nevela. That they make the cheese with the nevela animal, and because of that, the rabbis of the Mishnah prohibited the consumption of non-Jewish cheese. So from a kashrut level, the cheese is kasher, says the Rambam. But the rabbis of the Mishnah came along and made a gezerah. And the Rambam says, V'im tomar, and if you'll tell me, V'halo or hakeva davar katan hu ad me'od, that the amount of animal stomach they put in there is so small, b'chalav she'amad bo, compared to the amount of milk they put, V'lama lo yibatel b'me'uto, and why should it not be nullified because it's so small? Mipnei shehu ha'ma'amid gevinat, because it is the thing that turns it into cheese. V'ho'il v'davar ha'asur hu she'imid, harei hakol asur k'mo she'ber. And because the prohibited thing is what made it into cheese, then all of the cheese is prohibited. The Rambam adds one more section. Gevinat, cheese. Shema'amidin ota hagoyim. Please listen carefully to this Rambam, and will answer a lot of the questions I'm sure you have. Cheese that the goyim use asavim, plants, meaning no animals involved aside from the milk. It's vegetable rennet, vegetarian rennet. Or b'mei perot, or they use some kind of fruit juice, kagon seref te'enim, like the sap of figs. Vareheni karim bagvina, and you could tell that they're in the cheese, meaning that's what turned it into cheese. Horu miktzat geonim. Some of the geonim ruled shehi asura, that it is forbidden. Shekvar gazru al kol gevinat hagoyim, because they already ruled on all of the cheese of the goyim. Ben shehemiduha b'davar asur, ben shehemiduha b'davar mutar. Whether they used permissible curdling agents or prohibited curdling agents. Gezerah mishum shemiduha b'dvar asur, because of the prohibited curdling agents that exist. So the Rambam tells us that you would think that vegetable rennet in cheese would make the cheese kasher. So we can't do that. Ho'u miktat geonim, a small number of the geonim, they told us that that is prohibited, and it's included in the previous gezerah. Now, I will tell you that there are other places where the Rambam tells us Ho'u miktat geonim, that some of the geonim have said. But in those places, the Rambam usually brings another opinion that disagrees with that miktzat geonim who say. Here, the Rambam mentions Haru miktzat geonim bistam, like that's what he understands the halakha to be. We're going to see this reflected in the writings of Maran in just a few minutes. The Rambam then says, on the top of Yud Gimel, Ha'ochel Gevinat goyim, somebody who eats cheese of goyim, or chalav shechalavuhu ve'en Yisrael roehu, or milk that is not kasher milk, meaning you didn't have a way to check that the milk was kasher. Makin oto makat mardut. We beat him, not comfortable blows, let's say it that way. Now with me, let's go back to the tool. The tool was just telling us that according to the Rambam, so Rambam page 6, source 8, that according to the Rambam, this cheese is prohibited even when coming from a vegetable source. Maran of the Bet Yosef, and this is a lengthy piece of the Bet Yosef, and I wish I could go through all of it with you, but the parts that I highlighted are important. He brings many chachamim that disagree with the stance of Rabbi Yonatan. And if you look at the bottom of page 6 in the bottom, that even if you could tell me that they use vegetable rennet, says the Maran in the Bet Yosef, afilu ken, even so, asur lechol gevinat hagoyim, it's forbidden to eat that cheese, from the fish davar ze yireh shenesar b'minyan kemo hayayin, because this was prohibited as a rule by the rabbis in the Bedin, like the wine, v'chol davar shenesar b'minyan, and anything which was prohibited by the Sanhedrin. Afal pi she'asruhu l'ta'ana u batla ta'ana, haisur bimkomo hu omed. Any place where the reason does not apply, but that decree was made by the Bedin Hagadol, then there's nothing you can do about it. The reason doesn't apply, but the law still applies. V'chen hem divrei harambam, that's exactly what the Rambam writes, v'katav rabbeinu devarav b'samuch, ve'af al pi shelo katav harambam horah zo ele b'shem miktzat hageonim, and even though the Rambam quotes this opinion regarding vegetable rennet in the name of some of the geonim, mashma shekedivrehem hu sover, says Maran HaShulchan Aruch, it seems that that is the Rambam's opinion. She'im lo ken, because if that was not the case, havalel havi divrei cholkim alehem, he would have mentioned those who argue with the Rambam, with the geonim. And because the Rambam did not bring those who argue with this yesh miktzat, there's some of the geonim say, then that is the opinion of the Rambam to prohibit vegetarian cheeses as well, meaning cheeses that come from milk, but the ingredient in them that curdles them is vegetarian. And on page 7, the Maran is now going to rebuke the Jews of Italy. ומכאן תשובה לבני איטליה. And now this is a response to the Jews of Italy. שנוהגים היתר בגבינות הגויים, that they eat the cheese of the גויים, מפני שמעמידין אותם בפרחים ולא מצאו ידיהם ורגליהם. And they rely on this opinion that they use flowers, meaning vegetable rennet, to take the cheese into cheese. He says, and they're not able to justify this. And he quotes even according to Rabbi Yonatan, and he tries to show that Rabbi Yonatan would also agree to what he's saying. Why? Because his Rabbi Yonatan does not write that it's mutar. Let's look here. It seems to me, Maran says that it's possible Rabbi Yonatan wasn't ruling that Ashkenazim can now go ahead and eat cheese of goyim. אלא הוראה, וכן מוכיח תחילת דבריהם שכתבו אומר רבנו תם, כי עכשיו לא מצינו אותם פשוט לאיסור בגבינת הגויים. Rabbeinu Tam wasn't telling you to go buy cheese of goyim. Rabbeinu Tam was trying to give a logical explanation for why some people might not be so particular. It was a hora'ah, meaning it was a teaching, but it was not a ruling, a halachic ruling that he expected the world to follow. No, you don't have to accept Maran's understanding of Rabbeinu Tam, but if you look here in the left column, this is v'chol sheken b'makom she'arambam v'arashba. He said, but especially in a place where the Rambam and the Rashba say that these cheeses are prohibited, shehem amudei olam, that they are the pillars of the world. Osrim, they prohibit. V'gam ki b'chol shar mekomot Yisrael sheshamanu shemam nohagim le'esor. They, all of the Jewish communities that we know of, they treated this in the same way, which is very interesting. If you look by milk of goyim, there are many communities with varying customs. The same with butter of goyim. When it comes to the cheese of goyim, aside from those select communities that followed Rabbeinu Tam, we know that almost all of them treated the cheese in the same way that the Rambam and the Rashba did. ואינם מבחינים בין מעמידים בפרחים למעמידים בקיבה שאסור לפרוש מכלל ישראל. So they don't differentiate between vegetable rennet or animal rennet, and it's forbidden to separate yourself from the Jewish people. ולפרוץ גדרן של ישראל קדושים, and to break the walls of the holy Jewish people. אשר גדרו אבות העולם חכמי המשנה עליהם השלום. That the sages of the Mishnah, of blessed memory, they made these rules for us, and we therefore don't have the right to just knock down any rules that we don't like. So far, I will tell you like this. We saw that the Rambam and Rabbeinu Tam disagree as to the reason. The Rambam and the Rashba telling us the reason is because of the stomach lining of the animal, which is the Nevilah, and the Tosafot telling us that no, it's because of the scorpions, and because of that it might not apply here. And Maran clearly understands that even the vegetable rennet, like the Rambam says in the name of some Geonim, is prohibited to us. Now what does Maran actually write in the Shulchan Aruch? Let's look on page 10. On page 10. This is a quote from Maran here. This is the whole section of Shulchan Aruch. I wish I would do the butter today, but butter is not in my syllabus for today, so that's halakha 3. Look to halakha 2. On page 10, it's the top of the page, where it says bet. Gevinat hagoyim, the cheese of non-Jews. Asarum, our rabbis prohibited them. Why? Mipeneh shema'amidin otam be'or kevat shechitatam. Because they curdle them with the stomachs of their slaughtered animals. Shehi nevilah, which to us is considered a nevilah. Ve'afilu hemiduhu ba'asavim, and even if they use vegetable rennet to make the cheese, asura, the cheese is prohibited. This is what Maran rules. Now, I know there are many Sephardic voices in the world that want to tell me all kinds of things about cheese. At the end of the day, it's really easy to be Sephardic when it fits our agenda. But sometimes we have to also be Sephardic when we need to be Sephardic. Meaning, it's not always Matir Asurim. Sometimes also we have to, Maran writes, the Rambam says, what do you want me to do about it? How can I get rid of Maran and the Rambam? Now, are there creative workarounds? We could talk about that soon. But the basic halakha, the cheese of the goyim is prohibited, whether it's animal rennet or it's vegetable rennet. That's what Maran writes. He doesn't write Horu Miktat HaGeonim because the Rambam says that, and the Rambam says that is the law, and he's not worried about it. Haga. The Rama writes here, what about Ashkenazim? V'chen ha-minhag. That is the custom of the Ashkenazim also. So even though the Ashkenazim, like the Baalei Tosafot, may have been lenient, the custom in Ashkenaz, by the time the Rama comes on the scene, that is the minhag. Ve'en lifrotz geder, and it's forbidden to break down this fence. Im lo b'makom shenahagu behem heter mikadmonim. Says the Rama, unless you live in a place where the earlier rabbis already had a minhag to be lenient. V'im ha'Yisrael ro'eh asiyat ha'gevinot v'chaliva. And how do you make non-Jewish cheese kasher? Maran doesn't say that. So Maran doesn't tell us. The Rambam tells us how to do it. The Rambam says in the commentary of the Mishnah, as long as the Jew supervises the cheese making process, the cheese is kasher. The Rama writes this here, and he says, אם לא במקום שנהגו בהם היתר מקדם, ואם ישראל רואה עשיית הגבינות והחליבה, if the Jew sees the cheese making process and the milking process, מותר, it's permissible. וכן המנהג פשוט בכל מדינות אלו. And that is the custom in all of our countries. ואם ראה עשיית הגבינות ולא ראה החליבה, then if you saw the cheese making, but you didn't see the milking process, meaning you come to the factory and they already have the milk. Now they're just going to make the cheese, and you're going to supervise that part. יש להתיר בדיעבד. After the fact, you can permit it. כי אין לחוש שמא ערב בו דבר טמא, מאחר שעשה גבינות מן החלב, כי דבר טמא אינו עומד, ובוודאי לא ערב בו הגוי מאחר שדעתו לעשות גבינות. For sure, that you can tell that because it turned into cheese, you can certainly know that that was all kasher milk, and the non-Jew who was planning to make cheese wouldn't intentionally put something that wouldn't curdle in his milk. But it's forbidden to eat the milk that way, again, because you didn't see the milk and there's no way for you to know that this milk is kasher. I'll read to you one halakha from Maran, the next one. The butter of non-Jews. If you see people who permit that milk, the butter, you don't tell them anything. But if the majority of the community treats it in a prohibited way, they don't buy the butter of goyim, then you shouldn't buy the butter of goyim. In a place where there is no milk, then if it's done in a certain way, then it's muta. I don't want to deal with butter today. But I just want to tell you that butter is in a different category than cheese, and butter is in a different category than milk. There are varying customs regarding how we view butter. On page 11, the Shach. The Shach introduces a famous opinion of the Shach. And he has some compelling proofs to his opinion. The Shach tells us that it's not enough, like the Rambam, or Maran, or the Rama, that a Jewish person has to supervise the cheese making process, and that's what makes the cheese kasher. So understand here. The cheese made by goyim with animal rennet is prohibited. The same cheese made with animal rennet, with a Jewish person watching the animal rennet being put into the cheese, is now 100% kasher. Says the Rambam, it has to do with the seeing of the Jew. This is the gezerah. The Shach introduces something else. That our rabbis mentioned by cheese, that the cheese of goyim is prohibited. They don't use the words like they use by milk. The milk of goyim that a Jew did not see the milking is prohibited. In that case, says the Shach, we clearly learn that the cheese has to belong to a Jewish person in order for that cheese to become kasher. And possibly the Jew even has to be the one turning it into cheese, putting the rennet inside that makes it kasher. Because if it was all about seeing the cheese making process, the Mishnah would have said, cheese and milk that a Jewish person did not see their process is a problem. But it says milk that Jews did not see the milking process, or cheese of goyim are prohibited. I mean, cheese of goyim is its own category of things that are prohibited. You need a Jewish person to be involved in the cheese making process. It's not enough just to supervise. And like that, the Shach, in a very long note in source 1, he argues with everybody else and says that the cheese has to be involved with, the Jewish person has to be involved in the cheese making process itself, not just supervising it. By the way, in source 2, the Gaon of Vilna says something very similar. The Gaon of Vilna, in his comments on the Shulchan Aruch, he writes, all of this is according to the Rama. I need the Jewish person not to supervise the cheese. He needs to make the cheese. He has to pour the rennet into the cheese. So if you buy cheese, and that cheese is supervised by a kosher agency, but the person who poured the cheese in was not Jewish, according to the Shach and according to the Gaon of Vilna, that cheese is prohibited because of Gevinat shel goyim. Rabbi Avraham Danzig, one of my favorite Ashkenazi Chachamim in the world. Rabbi Avraham Danzig, otherwise known as Rabbi Avraham Danziger, from the place where he lived. He was not a professional Talmid Chacham. I mean, he was a businessman. And he writes at the beginning of his book, Chaye Adam, I know that when I publish my book of halakha, many people will mock me. Because who am I to be writing books of halakha? I don't have a job as a rabbi. When did he have a chance to learn Torah? When he was traveling, when he was working, when he was selling things? And he says, yeah, that's exactly when I learned Torah. That even the times that I wasn't able to learn Torah, I was constantly yearning for the Torah. And therefore, the teaching of our rabbis that if I leave the Torah will leave me, doesn't apply to me because I never left the Torah. Even when I couldn't involve myself in her, she was always with me. He asked that on his tomb, they shouldn't write any fancy titles about him. The only thing they should write, Avraham Danzig, Shenasa V'natan Be'emuna, who was honest in all his business dealings. Can you imagine a financially honest rabbi? Could be such a thing in the world. Rabbi Avraham Danzig is telling us his whole goal in life was to be honest. And he prefers that should be what's written on his tomb. Rabbi Avraham Danzig says that it's not enough for the Jewish person to see the milk being curdled into cheese, but he actually has to be involved in that process and turn the milk into cheese himself. In source 4, the Kaf HaChaim, Rabbi Yaakov Chaim Sofer, Sephardic commentary in Shulchan Aruch, he writes, V'im ha'Yisrael ro'eh asiyat ha'gevinot v'chaliva mutar, in source 4 on page 12. If a Jewish person sees the making of the cheese, then it's and the milking, it's permissible. That's what the Rambam writes. Udelo kehashach, and it's not like the shach that says that a Jewish person has to be making the cheese himself. And he brings many sources, and he quotes the Tiferet LeMoshe, who says, Dechol rayot hashach, that all the proofs of the shach enam muchachim, are not necessary, meaning they're not obligatory for me to accept. V'chol hatam shebasash b'isur Gevinat goyim lo shaychi b'Yisrael ro'eh. And all of the reasons why cheese are prohibited in the Talmud would all go away if a Jewish person was watching, and that's why watching is enough to make it permissible. And if the stomach of the animal is of a Jewish person, it belongs to him, and the non-Jew is putting the milk in, the Noda B'Yehuda says that's also fine. And that's assuming that the Jewish person is watching the milk process, meaning the non-Jew can make the cheese as long as a Jew is supervising that. Rabbi Yecheskel Landau, who was the author of the famous Noda B'Yehuda. Noda B'Yehuda, he was against all kinds of Kabbalistic influences in his community. And one of the things he really didn't like was the people were getting involved with amulets. They were writing all kinds of magical scrolls and putting them on their necks. There was a certain lady who had lost her mind, and she came to the Noda B'Yehuda, and she said, I need from you an amulet. You have to write. He said, I don't write amulets. It's not my business. I don't get involved in this stuff. He said, no, you have to. I won't leave here until you... So maybe Pikuach Nefesh is involved here. And so he took a blank piece of parchment, and he pretended to write on it, and he rolled it up into a scroll, and he put it in a leather pouch, and wear this on your neck for 30 days. And every day, go to the Beit HaKnesset and pray that HaKadosh Baruch Hu, she should heal you. And if on day 30, you open up this amulet, and you see that HaKadosh Baruch Hu has magically erased all of the writing that I put here, then you should know that your prayers were successful, and you can now resume normal living. And kachaya. Rabbi Yecheskel Landau was writing to one of his students about this opinion of the Shach. And he has a big contradiction with many of the Chachamim who discuss cheese. The Noda B'Yehuda was a Charif, he was a very sharp Chacham, and he said many people understood the Sugya incorrectly. And he says, ultimately, if you look on page 14 at the end of his words, right before source 6, that all of this opinion of the Shach and the other rabbis who say that a Jew has to be the one to put the milk, the rennet in the milk, it's not the case. The opinion that is factual is the one of the Rambam and the other Kadmonim, the early rabbis, who said that as long as the Jews supervise the cheese making process, the cheese is fine. Rabbi Yonatan Halevy Epstein, the author of the Aruch HaShulchan. It's an interesting Chacham. He comes from Sephardic roots. He mentions that his last name, Epstein, before the Spanish Inquisition, was Benveniste. Later in Morocco, that sometimes comes Benisti or Benishti or other such variations. So that became Epstein. I think Halberstam, that family, has a similar story about how they used to be Sephardic Jews who ended up in Ashkenazi countries. And he says that really the halakha is not like the Shach, it's like the Rambam. And as long as you see the cheese making process that is kasher, though he mentions at the end that if it's possible, then it would be really nice to be able to do it in a way that would work for everybody, also like the Shach, and why not get involved? Why get involved in that problem? So you see the rabbis are pretty split up here regarding the Shach, but the Rambam and Maran, their words stay true in the Rama. In source 7, Rabbi Moshe Feinstein writes a letter to Rabbi Yosef Tenler, alav shalom. I should have written it, it's actually just alav shalom. I studied for 5 years by Rabbi Yosef Tenler. He was the Rosh Yeshiva in near Israel in Baltimore of the high school. So maybe 4 years I studied actively by him. He was a very special man. I can't tell you that I'm a poster child of Yeshiva near Israel or of Rabbi Tenler. But if you look at my website, I wrote an article about him in which I compare some of the midot that he taught us to the Sephardic approach that I later picked up in the Beit Midrash of Harav Peretz. And maybe if I could forward that link, you're welcome to look at it after the class. Rabbi Tenler, aside from being the Rosh Yeshiva, was also the founder of the first Chalav Yisrael milk company in the United States. And so as it's called Pride of the Farm. And as such, he had many dairy questions that he asked Rabbi Moshe Feinstein. His connection to Rabbi Moshe Feinstein is that his brother, who I believe just passed away recently, Rabbi Moshe Tenler, alav shalom, he was at Yeshiva University. His brother, Rabbi Moshe Tenler, married Rabbi Moshe Feinstein's daughter. So it was the father-in-law of his brother. Rabbi Tenler once was reading to us a Mishnah, which a person who makes a mistake, they violate halakha mistakenly, they have to bring a korban chatat, a sin offering to the Beit HaMikdash. He said his father once told him, why does a person who makes a mistake in halakha, he doesn't know, it was a mistake, honest, why does he have to bring a sin offering? For which sin? He said, for the sin of not knowing halakha. A Jewish person has to be educated. You can't be uneducated. And so even if you made a mistake, of course, it's not held against you the same way as if you did it intentionally, but there still is a mistake that Jewish people think that they can be Jewish without learning about Judaism. And I'm speaking here particularly to those who pretend to observe halakha, but don't learn halakha. So to nobody here, all of you here are learning halakha right now. But to those who are religious with no halachic backbone, it would be quite troubling to them why they don't learn halakha. So he goes into this conversation about cheeses that a Jewish person didn't see the milking, but only saw the cheese making process, like the Rambam mentions in a very long letter. And I quoted to you here only so that you have it in case you want to look at it on your own. I didn't realize how long this letter was. And if you look here on page 20, I mean 19, he tells us that in America, in places where we drink milk from goyim, because we rely on the supervision of the government, chalav ha-companies, like we mentioned last week, meaning that we consider the milk around us to be chalav Yisrael, because we know for sure that it's milk. You can use that milk l'chatchila to turn it into cheese. And he has a few other points here, but I bring you then to source 20, where Mori Harav Yaakov Peretz writes the following. In source 8, on page 20, Mekomot shechalav goyim shelahem mutar. In places where the milk of non-Jews is permissible, kegon b'artzot habrit v'chadomena, like in America, in Europe, yesterday I spoke to them on the phone, in Europe also. V'chadomena, sheyesh alav pikuach memshalti, but because there is government supervision on the milk, she'im yarvu chalav tameh yanshu, that if they mix non-kasher milk in there, they will be punished. Im haya pikuach, if there was supervision, al yitzur Gevinat shemiduha b'devar kasher, that they put kasher rennet into the milk, pashut she'Gevinat kashera, it's obvious that cheese is kasher. Now, I bolded the words government supervision, and the second time he says supervision. So if the government supervises the milk, then we can use it to supervise the cheese. Last night, Harav Peretz told me that he intended here that the second supervision was of a Jewish person. So not that we would rely on government supervision to permit the cheese. But while he was on the phone with me last night, he said, there is room to say that the government supervision that we rely on by the milk could also be relied on by the cheese, though he wasn't comfortable saying that as a horah, but it's something that we're going to discuss again in the future. And I will tell you that even if you will read it that way, first off, Harav Peretz is not Moshe Rabbeinu, so just because he wrote it doesn't mean that the halakha has to be that way. But I would have a hard time justifying that approach, along with the opinion of the Rambam and Maran and others, that like the Rashba, who would clearly not agree in that situation. I was speaking earlier today with Rabbi Yitzchak, and he told me that possibly there's a way to read it like that, but Od Chazon HaMoed, we will still get there regarding cheese. So if I could summarize right now, before we get to our extra reading on page 21. Cheese that comes from goyim is forbidden because of the animal rennet that is used. What if they don't use animal rennet? They use vegetarian rennet or microbial rennet or any other type of rennet. It doesn't make a difference. According to the Rambam, according to Maran, according to the Rama, this cheese is still prohibited by the mere fact that it's a Gevinat shel goyim. And because it's Gevinat shel goyim, then we can't eat it due to a rabbinic decree. It doesn't matter what else might happen, the rules don't apply. Even if the rules don't apply, the decree still applies. And as much as you may have liked me for the last 6 weeks, I'm certain that I've disappointed some people right now because my opinion here is prohibitive and there's nothing much I could do. Like I told you, you can't dance on all the parties. So you can't follow Rambam your whole life, and then when it comes to cheese, you become a follower of Rabbi Yonatan. It just, something there is lacking to me. But I'm sure that people do that, and if you could live with that cognitive dissonance, maybe you'll have more cheese to eat in the world than I have. But I'm willing to say that I'd rather be in this camp than in another camp, and that brings us to the next question. And that is something that I don't have a real answer for you. I want to bring you a skira, a collection of chachamim that discussed various other types of cheeses, and to ask the following question. What makes a cheese a cheese? Understand my question? We have things like mozzarella cheese, Parmesan cheese. We also have things like ricotta cheese and cottage cheese and sour cream cheese. Is cream cheese cheese? Are yogurts cheeses? What about Lebanon? Is that cheese? Cream that's turned into not sour. If you ever met a Persian home and you've had it's sweet cream, but it's no longer liquidy. It's thick. Are those cheeses? What makes something a cheese that is prohibited and something that's not a cheese? It's just a dairy product that is permitted. I don't have, and if you look at my forum online, every time someone asks me this question, I send them somewhere else. Like Rabbi Yehuda, I'm not comparing myself. I don't have an answer to this question right now. But I want to show you a few other chachamim that did discuss these things. So if you look in source 1, on page 21, the Chaye Adam, Rabbi Avraham Danzig, in his book Chokhmat Adam, he writes that if you have milk that turns into cheese because they put a rennet inside of it, or you have milk that turns into cheese mimela, just because it's been standing out so long in the heat or whatever else, it turns into cheese. Asur de lo pluga banan. It's forbidden. The cheese that curdles itself, the milk that turns itself into cheese, just because it was sitting out for too long, and the milk that was turned into cheese with rennet, both of them are prohibited because they're both under the rabbinic decree against cheese. So the Chokhmat Adam seems not to differentiate between what you might call a hard cheese or a soft cheese. It doesn't really make a difference. As long as it's a cheese, it's prohibited. The Aruch HaShulchan says something different. The Aruch HaShulchan says, Omnam ledina en nafka mina klal, sharei afilu im barur hu shema'amidin b'dvar heter asur k'mo shneimar Rambam. If you know that there is vegetarian rennet in there, it doesn't make a difference. The Rambam said it's not allowed. He said, and therefore, if you have Gevinat pishuta shalanu she'en ba hamada klal, if you have the cheese in our country, I don't know what cheese he's talking about, but it's cheese that doesn't have any type of hamada. There's no curdling that is done with rennet. Mikol makom ha'isur b'mkomo omed mitam she'tba'er. The prohibition still applies because this is the davar hane'esar b'minyan. There's nothing we could do. So even though in our country says the Aruch HaShulchan, it's not like here in America where most of the cheese is vegetarian rennet, microbial rennet. There they didn't even have rennet. It's just milk that somehow curdled by the heat or whatever else. Think about a simple cheese. I don't know, like a farmer's cheese or a cottage cheese or something like that. Says the Aruch HaShulchan, that is also prohibited. It's part of the gezerah. In source 3, Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, alav shalom, writes a letter to his friend Rabbi Shimon Schwab, alav shalom. You might have heard of Rabbi Shimon Schwab. I think he was the rabbi of the German community in Washington Heights. I used to pray in his Beit HaKnesset sometimes when I would visit my family over there. And he asks him regarding, look at the bottom of page 21, Hine b'dvar hagvina, regarding the cheese, b'shem, now you have to practice your Yiddish transliteration. Kotted cheese. It's cottage cheese in Yiddish. She'amarti l'chvod torato she'esh tam lehakel. I told you orally in our conversations together that there might be reason to be lenient regarding cottage cheese. Because maybe it's not a real cheese that was included in the prohibition of cheese. Because the real prohibition is regarding cheeses where they use the enzymes, the rennet, to make it into cheese. Because that's the main reason here. And it goes about Rabbi Yonatan. And if you look at the bottom left, the cottage cheese and even though they've told me that in America, for example, they still put some rennet inside of the cottage cheese, listen to this here. So there is rennet in cottage cheese. So what's the reason lahakel? Even if you would convince me that rennet is a forbidden substance, Mistaber shenachshivo ma'amid. You shouldn't consider it the ma'amid, the curdling agent, regarding cottage cheese. כיוון דאין להגבינה שום תועלת מזה, דלא משובח טעם הגבינה במעט הרנת שנתנו שם יותר מכפי שהומדו מעצמה מצד הזמן והחום. Cottage cheese is made by letting the time and temperature. Basically, cottage cheese is spoiled milk. Let's say that way. Cottage cheese is spoiled milk. I'm sorry to ruin your breakfast for you. Yes? And what happens is that the time and the temperature curdles that milk and turns into cottage cheese. Says Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, yeah, they add a little bit of rennet. Why? Not because it makes the cheese bitter. It doesn't give any better flavor or anything like that. They add it, they only do it to hurry the process of the curdling. The factory doesn't want to let the cottage cheese sit there for 3 days. They'd rather it be done in 15 minutes and send it to the factory to be packaged. And even though they put this rennet, it doesn't count for anything. Betovat gvina, because it doesn't help the cheese. Elahu tovat hamocher, on page 22 at the top. It's not for the benefit of the cheese that they add the rennet, it's for the benefit of the seller that they add the rennet. שיש לו הגבינות איזה ימים קודם, ואין שייך לאסור מצד זה מטעם שהרנט מעמיד. He says he's only using the cottage cheese, the rennet and the cottage cheese to hurry the process. Then as such, it's not the same thing as adding rennet in order to make the cheese. וגם לבד סברה זאת, and if you don't accept this logic, הרי אף הוא רק זה וזה גורם. This thing is, there's a halachic question regarding something that has two ma'amidin. Two things make it into something. So let's talk about cheese. You have the heat and the temperature that's making it cheese, and you have rennet that's making it cheese. When there's a combination of things, then it would be permissible. ויש להחשיב זה רק מסייע בעלמא שאולי אף הסוברים לזה וזה גורם אסור, הווים מתירים כאן. And it could be that this is not a solid answer on its own because there are those who wouldn't accept that. ונמצא שמצד הרנט אין לנו לאסור אלא מצד עצם גזירת הגבינה שאסורה לרמב"ם והמחבר אף בעמידו בדבר המותר. So we're left again only with the prohibition of the Rambam and the mechaber. Who's the mechaber? When Ashkenazim say the mechaber, they mean the author of the Shulchan Aruch. They mean Maran. Yes, Maran and the Rambam who say that there's a over umbrella decree on this. He said, and according to Rambam and Maran, I would say, Rabbi Moshe Feinstein says, that this cheese is not really cheese that the Chachamim had prohibited, and therefore even the Rambam and Maran would accept that this is not real cheese. And then he writes at the bottom here, Mikol makom, nonetheless, lema'aseh, practically, eni omer b'zeh heter, I'm not telling you it's permissible. Aval gam eni moche ba'mekinin, but I also don't rebuke those who are lenient and they buy cottage cheese from the goyim. Machar sheyesh ta'am leheter v'umita d'Rabbanan, because there's logic that allows you to be lenient, and this is only a rabbinic prohibition. Listen to these words. It's only a rabbinic prohibition. V'gam ha yesh geonim shitiru legamre. There are some geonim that permitted this entirely. V'yesh tzaref shitadam sholim chot. And we will include their opinion, even though not to consume the cottage cheese, but not to rebuke other people who consume this cottage cheese. And therefore, I don't feel that there's a need for you, Rabbi Schwab, to tell people that it's prohibited if they didn't ask you. And maybe they might not even listen to you. So I don't think you should announce that cottage cheese is prohibited. They might not listen to you. I also don't think that you should tell people that cottage cheese is permissible. Just don't get involved. He said, I don't think it's proper to announce to the public that cottage cheese is okay. I'm sorry, Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, I just read this out loud to everybody. And he says, your friend, Rabbi Moshe Feinstein. That's an opinion here. Rabbi Yonatan Halevy Epstein, and how you reconcile this with what he wrote earlier, you can do your homework on your own in source 4 on page 22. He writes, in places where they permit non-Jewish butter, what will we do with milk that was let to sit for a few days, and the top of the milk congeals, it gets thick? And he used a lot of Yiddish words that I wish my wife was here in the room with me. She would help me translate all of them. But I don't know Yiddish, so I can't translate any of them. And he mentions there's the milk product that goes on top, there's the leftover at the bottom, there's the liquid that's left. All of them have different names in Yiddish. Is this milk that was just left out on a counter to turn into some homemade, quasi cheese, is that permissible? Meaning, is it like butter that's permissible, or is it like cheese? And he says in the end, V'nira la'aniyut dati, top left of page 22, it appears to me, the mekomot ha'rechokim, that in far-flung places, she'en la'Yisrael ma le'echol, where there's not a lot of kosher options for Jews, then maybe it's permissible. And he says, look in the Pri Chadash, who permits the kamaika. I'm certainly butchering the pronunciation of this word. There is a food that the Sephardim used to eat called kamaika or kamieka. If you know how to pronounce this word, please interrupt me now. Shemdimnat Turki, that in Turkey they used to eat it, and he says it's mutar. That it's just like butter, and that this soft cheese that they eat in Turkey, it's not really curdled with rennet, that it is permissible to eat. So I brought you the Pri Chadash himself, and the Pri Chadash says that exactly that food that they make in Turkey, which is a curdled milk that sits out on the counter for a few days, and the heat turns it into some type of soft cheese. Imagine like a sour cream of sorts, a soft spreadable cheese. That is mutar. And he mentions that there are many chachamim who disagreed. He quotes them. And if you look on page 23, he writes, Ani maskimi mahem. I don't agree with them. Mechila from these chachamim who said it's not allowed. I don't agree. If a rabbi would write that today, you know what would happen? How dare you say you don't agree with the... He doesn't agree. What does he want to write that? He agrees, but he doesn't agree. Because the poskim that came before me, I have a tradition from them that this is mutar. Who cares that the milk you could see it? The butter is the same way. We are eating butter, even the ones that are not cooked, like Maran mentions. And then he says here, it's also therefore permissible to permit the milk of the water of the milk of goyim, shehem hamayim hanisharim b'acharona, delo chazu limidei mitam, delet bo chashash ta'arovet chalav tameh uchedek chedvira. This would be referred to in English as whey. Have you heard of whey before? So they have cheese. So you have milk. You curdle it, and there's cheese. And I'm giving you again a layman's definition. There's a more complex definition of whey. And they take out the cheese, and the liquid that's left behind is used to form whey. And so he says that that's mutar. It's mutar, because you know now that it's kasher, and therefore the way of the goyim is permissible. Now I know there are those who are stringent about it, but v'chen yesh la'atir, and he talks about another form, and he mentions, if you look in the middle of the paragraph, v'nikra ricotta belaz, ricotta cheese. Now I don't know how ricotta was made where he lives versus how ricotta is made today, but he says ricotta cheese is a classic case of a cheese. Zo haricotta lo nichnasa tachat gezerat gvinot shel goyim. Ricotta is not included in the prohibition. Just because you call it cheese doesn't make it a cheese that our rabbis would have prohibited. And therefore, this ricotta cheese would be mutar. I will tell you that Rabbi Tendler told me, how do I know? Rabbi Tendler sent his grandchildren to learn in Lakewood. And one of the rabbis in Lakewood gave a whole speech. Rabbi Aaron Cutler was makbid on Chalav Yisrael and da-da. And he said, listen, my grandfather told me that Rabbi Aaron Cutler in the yeshiva, they used to have even the sour cream from the goyim that was not kasher. The milk, the sour cream. How could he tell me, Chaz v'shalom, you say such a thing about Rabbi Aaron Cutler? They threw him out of the yeshiva. Rabbi Tendler studied by Rabbi Aaron Cutler, and he remembers living in Lakewood and eating the sour cream from the goyim. They didn't consider that to be a problem of cheese that would be prohibited, just like the milk. Hava Peretz in source 6 brings a few practical cases. By the butter, he says it's mutar. Shamenet shel goyim, so the top left of page 23. Shamenet is the cream, like say like sour cream. Yesh osrim v'yesh matirim. Some prohibit, some permit, and it's like butter. Whatever you do with butter, we permit butter. You can also permit the shamenet. Leben, eshel, yogurt, dino kedin chalav goyim. All of those are considered just like milk, and they are all mutar. You don't need, just like you take the milk from the goyim, you can also do the same thing you do with leben and eshel and yogurt and all of those things. So regarding what is the definition of soft cheeses, I don't have a good answer for you. But there are chachamim who discussed what is a soft cheese. Is the rennet the main ingredient? Are there two things that are making it an ingredient? Those are interesting things to look at and to think through. And I'm open to having this conversation at a later time. I don't have solid halachic conclusions for you here. On page 23 on the left, Rabbi Yosef, he was living in a situation, this is the year 1952, about Israel was going through a depression, kids didn't have what to eat. Rabbi Yosef, in a very, very long letter, which I recommend you going through if you want to understand how he understood the Rambam and Maran and Tosafot and all of those opinions regarding cheese. I brought you the entire letter. So as Rabbi Yosef does, there are hundreds and hundreds of sources here. But Rabbi Yosef ultimately says that in a situation, well, a lot of sources, on page 32, or 33, on the top of the page 33, Maskanat de Dina, the bottom line of the halakha is The dina mutar liknot gvinot yivu habaot michul. We can buy these cheeses that come from outside of Israel. Shema'amidim otam be'avkot v'chadurim. That they use all kinds of powders and pills, meaning what you would call today microbial rennet, to turn them into cheese. In years of hunger, meaning in years where the financial situation is not good, you can give them not to adults, but to children. Children are able to eat those cheeses. The gezerah doesn't really apply to those cheeses, especially not to children. There's a long line of thinking that goes here, so don't walk away thinking this is mutar for you. But he did find a situation where he permitted these cheeses. Kraft cheese. I'm not interested in reading the whole source, but I found a source that Rabbi Soloveitchik, he ate Kraft cheese. Famously, Rabbi Soloveitchik in Kraft cheese, like the classic non-kosher American cheese that's around. It's not the luxurious cheese, it's not a fancy cheese, it's not any special type. It's the regular, whatever, I don't know what the brand would be anywhere else. From the regular cheese out there in the store, Rabbi Soloveitchik, he openly ate these cheeses. I think I heard there was a time that at Yeshiva University, they openly served those cheeses, though I'm certain that today, they would tell you the exact opposite, and that's not the case. But history revisionism is always wonderful. I brought here something that I'm excited to share with you, and that is on page 34. I'll end the shiur with this on page 34. But if I could just make a note about Rabbi Soloveitchik and Kraft cheese. There are a number of hechsherim in America, and I'm not going to discuss here hechsherim. I don't do that in public, definitely not in private. I don't do private, definitely not in public. There's one hechsher you see all over cheeses in America. It's kosher, this cheese is kosher. Why don't you rely on that hechsher? The interesting thing is that hechsher believes that cheeses that are made with microbial rennet don't require supervision. And as such, they supervise all these cheeses. I mean, their supervision is a non-supervision. They supervise the cheese that doesn't need supervision according to them. And so people say, let me buy that cheese, it has a kosher symbol. These rabbis fighting with each other. But really, I would tell you, those cheeses are kosher, certainly to Rabbeinu Tam. But for Rambam and Maran, those cheeses are absolutely prohibited. And therefore, even though those cheeses may be under supervision, but just because they're under supervision does not mean that they're fit for consumption for Sephardim or for anybody who's trying to follow the halakha of the Talmud. On page 34, in 2018, Rabbi Moshe ben Zaken, my dear friend from Los Angeles, gave me a call. Let me tell you about Rabbi Moshe ben Zaken. Rabbi Moshe ben Zaken is the type of man who, if you would put him in a laboratory and try to figure out what is he made out of, only goodness and a heart. Is a man who's kulo tov. I don't have words to say how great he is as a human being. Forget as a chacham. He's also a chacham, but as a human being. I didn't know him in 2015. I was thrown out of my old community. My stuff was put in the dumpster. And my Kehillat members and I had to start a new community. And we had nothing. No money, no books, nothing. Klum. Imagine nothing. We started all over. Shiviti started in February of 2015, but we launched in May, not because we intended to launch, because they threw us out. And I had nothing. I had a community with no Torah, no building. We started praying in my living room. Rabbi Moshe ben Zaken heard there was a community in San Diego. He's from Los Angeles. There's a rabbi who doesn't have a Torah. He gave me a call. So, are you Rabbi Halevy? Yes. I was also a Sephardic rabbi that was fired from my community after a few years. Do you have somebody who can come pick up a Sefer Torah for me? He doesn't know me. For all I know, there's some guy in San Diego going to steal his Torah. He sent me this beautiful, tens of thousands of dollars, a Spanish-Portuguese Torah, one of the most beautiful Torahs we ever had the honor of having in our community. He sent it to me from Los Angeles. And we had it for a year and a half. And every rabbi, says, keep it until you have your own. And we had our own Sefer Torah. I said, no, keep it still because you need two Sifrei Torah for the holidays. How are you going to auction off the things on the holidays without having enough money for your community? You need two Sifrei Torah. And of course, over time, we became friends. And when I had to put together our Bet Adin in Los Angeles, Harav Peretz made a few rules. Which kind of rabbi can you choose to have in your Bet Adin? So we deal with conversions primarily. And Harav Peretz's rule was the following. He has to be a Talmid Chacham. What does it mean Talmid Chacham? He has to be a Torah scholar that people know. They recognize he has a community, something. He has some position that people know. Fine, one. That was easy to find. I found a lot of rabbis. Rabbis are everywhere. Number two, he has to be a Talmid Chacham who, if his halachic rulings are questioned, if one of our conversions are questioned, he will be able to pen a halakha on his own. Let's say to the chief rabbi of Israel. And without me being involved, the independent members of the Bet Hadin have to pen their own teshuvot. They have to be able to do that. That was harder to find. To find a Torah scholar in America, forget who knows how to write in Hebrew, but who knows how to learn halakha well, was very difficult for us. It wasn't so simple. The third, he has to be a good person, a kind person. So no mean people, no people with attitude, no people with ego, no nice, kind people. That makes it even harder. Now you want a rabbi who's nice and he knows halakha. It's already like, it's a very tall order Rabbi Perez is giving me. And the final order was the worst though. He has to hate money. Not that he doesn't take money, has to hate money. And that is almost impossible, my friend. I'll tell you, there was 2 years that Bet Hadin was between Dayanim. We couldn't find a third Dayan. What does it mean, hate money? We do giyuim. And the amount that we charge for giyuh is $0 and also 0 cents. And not under the table, not over the table, not around the table. It's an industry. Out here in America, I don't know what it's like in the UK or elsewhere, you could charge $15,000 to $30,000 to do a giyuh. And if we charge that, then we'd all have houses and cars and bakol mikolko. But we don't take a penny. If somebody wants to donate forward, fine. There's other ger that needs tefillin and you want to buy him tefillin, yes, you can give the money to the Bet Hadin and we'll buy a person a pair of tefillin. That's fine, you could do that. Rabbi Moshe ben Zaken ticked all of those boxes. Not only does he not take money, he loses money. Every time we do a giyuh, he brings towels for the people. He goes to buy new towels. You come out of the mikveh with towels. He buys chocolates and candies for the children. Rabbi Yosef Zarnigian, who's the third member of Bet Hadin, 2 years we didn't have a dayan until we found him. Not a penny. Not a penny. He flies from the other side of the country. Not a penny. Rabbi Moshe ben Zaken asked me to do something. Anything he asked me to do, I'm going to do. Rabbi Moshe runs a kosher certification in Los Angeles, along with his nephew. And they wanted to know, what could we do about cheese factories if all we need is to have a person in the factory watching the cheese making process? Then what would be the case if we put up video cameras and we watched the cheese making process through closed circuit TV, real live video cameras? Would that count? I asked Rabbi Peretz, he didn't want to get involved. He's like, listen, this is like kosher agency stuff. I don't deal with kosher agencies. The mafia is going to come after me. Like, yeah, Rabbi Peretz it's a good question. If you wanted to do it yourself, I talk to you. But you want to publicize this as a ruling for the whole world? I'm not interested. Is it you should ask Rabbi Eliyahu Abergel. Rabbi Eliyahu Abergel is the Av Bet Hadin of Yerushalayim. He's retired, but he's still Av Bet Hadin of Yerushalayim. I sat with him a few times at Bet Hadin. Once I saw him, he did a chalitza. He's the last people in the world who knows how to do a chalitza properly. And that's why he comes to the Bet Hadin. And so I asked him this question via my chavruta, Rabbi Yitzchak Abitbol. He's now a rabbi in Miami. Rabbi Yitzchak Abitbol and I studied by Rabbi Peretz. And when I left Israel, he went to Rabbi Abergel to study Dayanut. He's an expert in the laws of Gittin. Rabbi Abitbol posed this question to Rabbi Abergel, and Rabbi Abergel wrote him the following answer. He says, this includes all cheeses, butters, everything like that. If you inspect the factory and you ascertain that there is no animal rennet, they don't use in this factory animal rennet, they only use kasher ingredients here. If you put up cameras and supervise the pouring in of the kasher rennet after that initial inspection, he says it's enough to be considered, if I can find the exact words, ולכן שרי ליצור גבינות למהדרין כמו דין חלב. He said you can label these cheeses mehadrin. They're mehadrin kosher as long as you watch them through a video camera and make that inspection. When I called back Rabbi Peretz with this letter, Rabbi Peretz told me, Dai v'hutar, it's even more than you need. This is already too much, but this is fine. He agrees also. And technically, I have this letter, by the way, because Rabbi Abergel photocopied it and gave me a copy. But it could be that it's already found in a new volume of his Teshuvot, Dibrot Eliyahu. I haven't seen the later editions that have come out. But this has never been published beyond my Kehillat or beyond Rabbi Moshe ben Zaken until now. And that is that it would be possible to not have to get into sticky situations and find cheeses that are not kasher. We want to make them kasher. If kashrut organizations were willing to allow us to do these things, to inspect factories, to put up cameras, to be there, I am certain that we could bring thousands and thousands and thousands of types of cheeses to the kasher market that are all kasher, because they're kasher anyways. All we need is Riyat Yisrael, and we'll be able to do Riyat Yisrael even through a video camera. I told my Talmidim here that if they would set it up for me, there's a factory that they found. Forget a camera. I would go without a camera. They would tell me once a week I have to come watch the Rennet. I would do it for free. just so the Jewish community would have a selection of cheeses. Find me a company that makes kasher cheese, and I want a penny for it. I just want Jewish people. The Jewish people should have the ability to not feel oppressed by kashrut, because cheese is that easy. All you need is for it to be kasher and for a Jewish person to supervise it. Rabotai, I'm going to call the shiur, we're going to end it right now. I want to thank all of you for learning Torah with me. This topic of the shiur is one that I've never had the opportunity to sit down and teach from A to Z, and I really thank you and the Habura for pushing me to bring notes about it and dig up sources about it. I really appreciate the opportunity to learn with you. I'm here to answer any questions that you might have, B'ezrat Hashem, and God willing, I look forward to seeing you for our final session next week, B'ezrat Hashem. Thank you so much. Tiskun Mizvot.